Hi, my name is Drew Soberlicht, and I will be doing my author discussion on Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15th, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. He grew up with his mother, father, older sister, and younger brother. In his early school, King was considered a gifted student, skipped several grades, and entered college at an earlier age than most. At the age of 15, he attended Morehouse College. Later on, he graduated in 1948 with a Bachelor of Arts degree in sociology. In 1951, he attended Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, and graduated with a Bachelor of Divinity degree. He also received his PhD in 1955 from Boston University. One day during his childhood, Martin Luther King Jr. and his family experienced the true meaning of Jim Crow laws when the family was kicked out of a shoe store because of the color of their skin. This occasion was the family's first experience being racially discriminated against, which was an extremely life-changing event for them. Later on, unfortunately, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. King led an extremely successful life with many accomplishments, striving for equal treatment of all people of all different colors. His legacy of his success will carry on for eternity. Involvement in the Civil Rights Movement. In 1955, Martin Luther King led a boycott against city buses known as the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which refused to permit African Americans to sit in the front seats of the bus. This argument led to a boycott throughout the whole city until the laws were changed indefinitely. Years later, in 1957, Martin Luther King established a civil rights organization that supports the philosophy of nonviolence called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was founded in 1957. This association led to the 381-day Montgomery bus boycott a few years earlier. Later on in 1963, Martin Luther King led his famous I Have a Dream speech, which was the largest gathering in the history of Washington, D.C., which consisted of 200,000 people. This was King's first address to the entire nation on the topic of equal voting rights, in which he urged America to give voting ballots to everyone, not just whites. In response to the movement, the Civil Rights Act was soon created and established in 1964, which completely banned discrimination in employment and public accommodations based on race, color, and religion. Due to his courageous work to introduce civil rights in 1964, Martin Luther King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Clearly, many people did not agree with him and his movements and ideas. Therefore, he was suddenly arrested in Selma, Alabama in 1965. As years went by and the world began to come together, Martin Luther King became an advocate for the Memphis sanitation workers' strike. This strike consisted of a group of African American men and women who were treated horribly. From terribly low pay to inhumane conditions, it forced these victims to go on strike for their deserved rights and freedom. Overall, Martin Luther King will always be remembered as a heroic and determined soul who has begun the path to freedom and equal treatment of all people for the United States that exists in the world we live in today. Literature. Over the years, Martin Luther King has written several pieces of literature that have had great impact on the past and current society that we live in today. One of his pieces, I Have a Dream, is based on a public speech delivered by himself, Martin Luther King Jr., during the March on Washington for Freedom, in which he demanded civil rights for all people and an end to racism and discrimination in the United States. Another piece of writing known as Why Can't We Wait was a book written by Martin Luther King Jr. in 1964 about the nonviolent movement against racial discrimination in the United States and the 1963 Birmingham campaign. The book talks about how 1963 is known as a landmark year in the civil rights movement because it was the start of America's Negro Revolution. Also, Martin Luther King wrote Strength to Love, which was published in 1963. Primarily describing racial segregation in the United States and specifically talking about the religious values. Another piece known as Stride Toward Freedom, the Montgomery Story, is Martin Luther King Jr.'s perspective of the Montgomery bus boycott. The book describes the conditions of African Americans living in Alabama during this time and describes the events of the boycott and its aftermath. Lastly, the book Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community was written in 1967, in which King advocates for human rights. This was King's last book before his assassination. And that's all.